My name is Paul Constant. I am the moderator of the panel. First of all, I want to thank Fuse Washington and my employer, Civic Ventures, for co-hosting this. And I want to thank Town Hall for giving us this space tonight. It's such a wonderful space. I really, every time I walk into the new Town Hall, I just fall in love all over again. And the downstairs especially. This used to look like a church basement, which had its charms, but this is really something. It's just very impressive. So thank you to them. Just to give you a little bit of context on where I'm coming from, I was the books editor at The Stranger from 2008 to early 2015. I also covered the 2012 presidential election. I left The Stranger in 2015. Maybe we'll get into why a little later. Then I went to work at Civic Ventures, where I do political messaging. I also, in my spare time, co-founded a website called the Seattle Review of Books, which is a book review, news, and interview site. That is something. So I'm coming to this as a former reporter and also somebody who runs a media site. You will have plenty of opportunity to ask questions. We have two microphones, one on either side. I'll let you know when it's time to line up and to ask your questions. And I promise you'll have plenty of time. So, without further ado, let's get to the panel. On the far end here, we have Adrienne Russell. She's the Mary Laird Wood Professor in the Department of Communication. That's right. Department of Communication and Associate Director of the Center for Communication and Civic Engagement at University of Washington. Her research explores journalism and activist communication and how they shape coverage of various pressing social issues, including climate change, corporate and government surveillance, and tech policy. She's written 2 books on journalism, Networked, A Contemporary History of News and Transition, and Journalism as Activism, Recoding Media Power. In the center, we have Clifford Cawthon, a professor of political science. That's right?
That's just a nickname.
Yep.
Just a nickname.
Yeah, no, it's not Clifford Cliff.
No,
Yeah. He's a professor of political science and cultural and ethnic studies at Bellevue College and a local freelance journalist. He's reported on housing, racial justice, and local politics. In addition to his work as a journalist, he's also been a workers' rights and community organizer, working on historic campaigns such as the Fight for 15. Currently, he's living and thriving in South Seattle. And to my immediate left here, we have Peter Jackson. And you step on my lines with applause, and then I give you a good space, and you just miss it. Peter Jackson is a freelance journalist. He's the former editorial page director of the Everett Herald. He also worked at crosscut.com shortly after its inception, writing the Daily Scan, a compendium of local news, as well as original stories on local, state, and national politics. During his Everett service, Peter wrote a series of editorials questioning the wisdom of Pacific Northwest coal export facilities, which received the Dolly Connolly Award for Excellence in Environmental Reporting. He also experienced and survived the Herald's ownership transition from the Washington Post to British Columbia-based Sound Publishing. He's a graduate of Georgetown University, a former Vista volunteer, and a co-founder of the University of Washington Center for Human Rights. He and his wife, Lori Werner, live in Seattle. So, first, I guess I wanted to ask each of you about your personal experience with the decline of traditional media and journalism, either as a consumer or an expert or a participant. And we'll start with you. Yeah, sorry, this is being recorded for several different outlets, so
So I would say that my experience with the decline of journalism, or the transition that it's gone through, sort of mirrors my experience as an academic. I got my PhD in the late 90s in a journalism school that thought the internet was a trend. It was they were sure it was going to pass, and it was sort of my topic was the influence of the internet on journalism, and they thought that it was probably not a great career move for me, but it ended up being a good career move for me because it was such a significant influencer in what happened in not just American journalism, but journalism all over the world. So I have been, for many years, tracing and researching and thinking about these issues. And so I've lived a bunch of different places over these past 15 years, 20 years. And I've had a chance to see up close what these impacts are on journalists, on civic life, on activists, and on issues that are of importance to publics. So.
Thank you. And first of all, thank you for coming out tonight. And all of you are beautiful. This is fantastic. Give yourselves a round of applause. Go ahead. Brag on yourself. Super. Yeah, and for my friends from the 37th Legislative District, little shout out for you. Woot woot. Anyway, yeah. So, anyway, to question. Like I tell my students at BC, I am a child of the internet. So most of my organizing career actually has happened in tandem and has taken up majority of my professional life, really for my entire adult life. So in terms of the decline of print media, I've been in the middle of that transition and really adapting to the new landscape. And in fact, we were talking a little bit about this in the green room, but my experience of it is basically, instead of the idealized kind of digital landscape that we have, that we are given the outset of the internet and the rise of digital media, that I've seen increasingly become an uneven battlefield based upon the commodification of digital media. Meaning, instead of creating content to critically engage, challenge, and to invite people to engage with each other, it's more in some of this is cliche, but it's more become a battleground for, or rather a platform for reactionaries to be able to spew their bile, and it has become an uneven, and I would say even a treacherous battleground for whether it is critical journalism to be able to fight against the current of reactionaries, and also on the one hand, a really great platform for grassroots journalism. So essentially, the new media landscape and the decline of print media and the rise of digital media is a double-edged sword. Because on the one hand, you have blogs like Black Girl Dangerous, and you have websites like Color Lines, you have Crosscut, you have all these great things coming out. Yet, on the other hand, you have just as many platforms for things like local TV stations that will remain nameless, you have InfoWars, so on and so forth, right? So, just to kind of put a pin on my answer, that I think that we're in a very interesting time that requires that if we have an interactive media, it requires us now more than ever to approach it just like civic engagement, that we can no longer be spectators. We have to be participants to some degree. I look forward to exploring this. Thanks. Sorry.
Can you hear me? Yes. Well, you know, I kind of want to take the positive view on this, that media is transforming, whatever the cliches might be. It's going through a pretty bad phase, obviously, right now. And starting in high school, I worked at a place called the Enumclaw Courier Herald, which was a weekly that was very important to the people in Enumclaw at the time. And since that time, and in my varied positions, I have a kind of eclectic, which is also code for probably bohemian or non-traditional route in my own sort of approach to media and my own career. The importance of local news, I mean, that was a touchstone, and everyone would read the Enumclaw Courier Herald in that area. And my greatest concern, whether we call it a transformation, whether we call it disruption, whether we call it decline of media, is losing that, because I think, as most people agree, I mean, the New York Times and the Washington Post and a few others are going to continue on, and there's there is hope in that respect. But you see it in places like Everett, and I see my old boss Neil Pattison in the back, so I can't say anything untoward. But I was there. I was at the brief time that I was editorial page editor. I witnessed the transition from the Washington Post, which actually owned the Everett Herald, and it was the only daily paper that the Graham family owned, other than the Washington Post. Ironically, Katharine Graham decided that papers grow north, and so in 1977, she and her family bought the Everett Herald. And then it was sold to Sound Publishing, which is a little bit more of a troubling enterprise for various reasons, including not being particularly worker friendly, and it was difficult to witness that. And part of it too is what kind of community spirit it has, or civic spirit. And so my hope, and I think the hope of a lot of people at the Herald and a lot of good writers and journalists and all of you who care about an issue like this, that the hope is that with the transition to digital media, that we're going to still have a local audience. And maybe that is another thing, and another topic that we can talk about at some point, is what's going to happen in terms of questions of equity. I mean, do low-income people, are they even going to be able to subscribe to the online version of some of these outlets? And I worry about kind of the common conversation. So yes, transforming, but hope, there's hope.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Sure.
So, Paul, when you were talking about, when you were talking about your experience, it jogged my memory, and it reminded me of the first time I actually had some modicum of power in a media outlet. So I was effectively the editor-in-chief of Buffalo Indie Media when I was younger, and this was, goodness, I'm both going to date myself and probably botch the date, but whatever. Right. So on, it was 2000. I want to say it was 2010, and one of the interesting things about this was it was my first time in this position of power, so I'd start thinking about not just ethical journalism standards, but also what kind of media source, what kind of media outlet we want it to be. And in this evolution of the media, we also have to start defining and creating a new typology when it comes to media. In fact, Adrienne, just to shine a spotlight on something we were talking about in the green room, if I can. And one thing you highlighted was the advocacy, or the nature of advocacy media. And I remember, doing a bit of research in my postgraduate at the University of Manchester, and during my undergraduate at Buffalo State, shout out for SUNY, State University of New York, about the rise of advocacy media. And for me, I think that we don't really have a common language, and we are just starting to create that type of consciousness around types of media, because and I talk to my students about this a lot, because these days there's advocacy media, there's edutainment, and that what one could consider objective reportage, or objective local reportage, or if there ever was such a thing as objective reportage, because of course as we know that there's a history of racial and class bias in terms of press coverage, right? Which we can talk more about, but that kind of very who, what, where, when, why reportage is being supplanted by edutainment, is unfortunately conflated with advocacy reporting that needs to happen. But more importantly, the really critical and great reporting where we will call something what it is. So, we will call a crisis, or we will, a lot of that is being curbed. And I experienced this when I was doing freelance work, for the Emerald back in the day when I was much younger with indie media. And, even today I have to think twice when I do freelance articles. Essentially, we have to curb that critical, if you will, that critical calling out of objective crises or really reactionary and regressive behavior because of backlash and because we don't have that consciousness around the type of media that exists today or these different types of media as time goes on and as it evolves.
Okay. Everybody here has said something that I could spend 90 minutes on, so I'll be trying to swoop back to address those issues. Adrienne, I guess I wanted to ask you, we know that this is a national problem, maybe even a global problem. I'm not so sure about that part, but is Seattle's media landscape unique? Are we suffering a deterioration of media at a faster rate or a slower rate, or do you even suspect my premise of deterioration as a real issue?
Well, I'm not sure exactly how the numbers compare. So I can't say deterioration in terms of, for example, the number of reporters who have lost their jobs, or the number of dollars that have left, the Seattle Times, for example, in the last several years, or the journalism industry in general. But I can cite my colleague, Matt Powers, who's here today, work, who's done a lot of research on the specific instance of Seattle, and especially compared to Toulouse, France, which is a city of similar size that has experienced similar decline in journalism. And I think one of the interesting things that he's found is that what's unique about Seattle is that there has been a huge influx of startup money for startup ventures because of the clear decline of traditional journalism, and that has bred a lot of innovation. And so in that sense, I'm not sure if it's the only place where you can see that dynamic. Certainly there's other cities that are experimenting with really interesting online platforms, but the number and the sort of innovation that's happening here, I think, is unique. But with that said, funders tend to like to fund new things, and so it's very difficult to sustain these innovative platforms even when they are successful, because if you can only get a grant for a startup or a new idea, then eventually you can't sustain yourself. So in that sense, I think it's unique. In some senses, I think it's mirrors what's happening at the national level, for sure. On the one hand, there's a absolute bottoming out of the business model. On the other hand, there's all of this innovation, and I think maybe 10 years ago, most people were much more optimistic about it, and now we're seeing what happens if you don't have traditional institutions, news institutions in place, like the manipulation and the sort of darker side of the free-for-all that the internet is.
Peter, you were at Crosscut at the beginning, and that's one of the, to my mind, that's one of the few really bright spots in terms of growth that they've delivered. I guess full disclosure, Crosscut was founded by David Brewster, who founded Town Hall, for whatever that's worth. I also founded Seattle Weekly, so I think what does he call himself in his bio now? A serial founder, I think is what he calls himself. So can you talk a little bit about what was it like being there at the beginning, trying to establish a new media organization? Because what Adrienne was saying about that level of trust is important, and you can't sort of manifest that out of thin air.
Yeah, I think a lot of, because of the trust and respect and the kind of gravitas that David brought to it, it was exciting. And it was about 10 years ago. It's interesting. There was optimism 10 years ago. And things like, for example, I don't want to go off subject, but there's something, Kaiser Health News is a good example. They started around the same time. And because that's why I have my man purse of chemo, you don't know where to go for health news. So you go to Kaiser Health News, which is outstanding, but it's still Kaiser. And so it's interesting that you do have these agendas at times before. It certainly gives you a frame of reference. But I think things were optimistic. I think a lot of it hinged on David's reputation as a serial innovator. It also revolved around a lot of very generous donors, including people like Tom Alberg and Jerry Grinstein and others who believed in David, and so it was a for-profit model at the outset, and he quickly ran into, and the team there really ran into problems within, I think, the first couple of years, and then there was the switch to the nonprofit model, which worked for a while, and now they're one of the biggest newsrooms in the Seattle area, and that's largely, I want to say, not only because of the hard work over time, but because they partnered with KCTS, right? And so that has been a huge, I think that was a lifesaver for Crosscut. So no, it was exciting. It was kind of like, yeah, you felt like you were present at the creation, and I was almost ancillary to a lot of this. I mean, it was sort of the old guard that kind of, and I should say, David has a new thing called postalley.org, or something.
I just heard about this the other day.
And
yeah.
so he's got, and so, it keeps going, the Brewster legacy. But I think, as was mentioned before, I mean, there's still no real sustainable business model, and the only sustainable business model now we have is with Crosscut, is that you can give your nonprofit, you can give your tax deductible contribution to it. And what would be interesting would be to find out more about how the Seattle Times version of this is working, because they have partnered with the Seattle Foundation, I believe, to if you want to contribute just to investigative reporting, you can give your tax deductible contribution to the Seattle Foundation, that then gives it to this unit within the Seattle Times, even though the Seattle Times is a private enterprise. And that's the answer. But it was exciting.
I mean, there was a time longer than 10 years ago now where the internet seemed like it was going to democratize all this in a really astounding way, right? Everybody had a platform and everybody had a voice, and it was easier than it's ever been in history to publish something. And so the idea was that there were going to be all these little newsrooms popping up everywhere, and there have been some. The South Seattle Emerald has been amazing. There was a Seattle-ish was an important news source for a few years there until they finally went their own direction because they couldn't monetize. So I think it's important. Oh, and also that, different communities were going to finally have a voice in a way that they were never going to. And then, I mean, it seems like to me that sort of social media came along and ate news media's lunch and did a horrible job of it. And so can we talk a little bit about what ownership means? It seems like unless you can find like a billionaire with a hankering to start a newsroom, you're kind of out of options. And Cliff, do you have,
Oh yeah, no, I'd love to tackle that. I mean, it's the name of the game these days. That what we're seeing is the rapid consolidation of the media. In fact, this was one of the things that I was thinking about the most on my way over here, and scribbling down random thoughts today, thinking, oh, what's a really smart thing I could say about this? Because it's clear. And we see it around us, whether it's Sinclair gobbling up local TV stations, which, I'm not going to name names, but we all know which station, whether it's Sound Publishing gobbling up all of these local weekly papers, right? Or on the national level, where we have major film studios, major corporations gobbling up other major competitors, right? And this is the interesting thing, that when we see, and I really want to bring this in because this is a point that needs to be discussed. And I actually come from a family of journalists. In fact, my mother met my father when they were both writing for, I believe it's the Syracuse Courier. And one of the interesting things growing up was I always had this consciousness about how white the news media was. And even to this day, despite, I want to give a shout out to both the South Seattle Emerald and the International Examiner, not just because I've written for them quite a bit, but also because they've both taken or made great strides in really empowering, providing opportunities to young journalists of color, myself included. That being said, when you see this trend towards media consolidation, that journalists of color tend to be those who are most adversely affected. Feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. And that's what we're seeing, that we see a narrowing of opportunities in terms of hiring, in terms of the ability for, and this actually goes back to, the lack of support for local news outlets, and the inability for certain media outlets to be able to monetize because the market's so saturated that essentially you have fewer spaces for really journalists of color and even media outlets from underrepresented communities to grow these days. And that is a real challenge due to ownership. And how we break that up? Honestly, besides revising antitrust legislation, especially for modern media outlets, that's one thing, but also, Peter, you touched on this a bit, really some smaller local online publications embracing the membership model. And actually, this is where all of you come in, and this is where really local journalism becomes less of a, or consuming local journalism and consuming grassroots journalism becomes less of a spectator sport and act of political resistance, supporting that with your dollars, supporting that with your reposts, supporting that in terms of really encouraging these more rebellious and dare I say reverent and really critical sources to grow, especially from underrepresented communities, and especially when, quite frankly, they're just saying real things,
Yeah, and this question isn't necessarily to you, but it sort of builds on that. In that, what do you do when the media outlet is dedicated to covering communities that don't have resources? Like, for instance, we have Real Change News, which you support by buying from street vendors. Real Change has shrunk a lot in the last 10, 15 years, and Seattle's homeless community has grown, but they're not going to be able to they don't have enough money so that a newsroom is going to pay attention to those. They don't have the resources, right? They certainly have a voice, but there's no avenue for them to get that voice into mainstream media outside of Real Change. So what do you do when it's not a middle class problem, or even or there's no money involved at all? Like, how do you account for that in a space where the media environment is shrinking?
I just rather not be hegemonic tonight. I mean, I could,
Say
but
something and then I'll say something.
right on, nice one. Teamwork makes the dream work. So, so there are several things, and there are several points of responsibility. And the reason I use the term responsibility a lot is because it's not easy, and there is really we get from it what we put in, right? So just remember that for these several different actors in keeping news that really tells the story of underrepresented communities alive, right? So first of all, when it comes to reporting and when it comes to reporters, that honestly we have to be responsible. We have to, and when I say responsible, I should actually say we have to be critically responsible. And what I mean is that we have to keep the. So there was this ethos when I was writing for the South Seattle Emerald that you should go where the silence is. Yes. If you're out there, Marcus, thank you for that line, right?
That's
so
good.
so you should go where the silence is. And really, for me, when I was writing, I saw my duty as going to those who are most affected and those whose perspective may make white middle class America uncomfortable, or tell us something about ourselves that we might not know, or reiterate something that we know but really goes unaddressed in mainstream policy debates, right? And to some of you, maybe I'm speaking to a choir, and to some of you, it might fly in the face of what you would think in terms of reporting, because there's this idea of objectivity. the media is not objective. Objectivity, I find to be kind of farcical sometimes, because when we just look at, and this goes back to ownership, when we look at the structure of ownership and we look at who's behind and by the way, when I say there's no such thing as objectivity, I don't mean that there's no such thing as reporters who are reporting on the facts, and as you should, the who and where, when, why, and it's not like we make this stuff up, right? It happens in real life, but at the same time, that there is a person, that there are politics behind, whether it's a keyboard, whether it's a camera, whether it's the printing press, there are politics there. So for us as journalists, that especially for publications that cover underrepresented populations like Real Change or the Emerald or the International Examiner and so on and so forth, right? That we have to take that responsibility seriously, and that may sometimes just require going to who is usually not considered newsworthy or trustworthy, right? And then the other thing, this is where all of you come in, and there's two sides of this. One, there is that kind of consumer responsibility. If you're not a member, or if you don't subscribe to a local publication, I would highly suggest you do, because there is a very objective need for that sustaining capital for these local publications. But two, and this for some of you might catch you a bit off guard, I would engage with the news outlets that you consider to be right-wing propaganda, or you consider to be unreputable, and actively push back against a number of these misconceptions. And I would suspect that we're going to be talking about the echo chamber. But when I talk to my students, I say when I got back to America after getting my master's in England, I would watch Fox News for an hour a day. I would watch Fox News for an hour a day actively, just so I could reacclimate myself to American political discourse. Did I find it to be reprehensible? Oh, absolutely. Did I find it to be racist? Oh, absolutely. Did I find it to be sexist or revolting and all the things I personally find it distasteful? Absolutely. But at the same time, I need to be able to engage. So that's another thing. And then last but not least, it really goes to those publications having a level of courage, because and I'm sure, I know, Adrienne and Peter, that you both have stories about publications, particularly smaller publications that focus on, underrepresented communities for days, or myself. But I will say this, that for the publications that are focusing on underrepresented communities, anchor yourselves, stay anchored, and don't be afraid to anchor yourselves, despite how challenging it is, and how essentially it's easy to, it may seem like the smart thing to take your focus off those populations. But they do need to have courage and to stay rooted in those communities by A, creating leadership positions, B, creating some way of being accountable to those populations and root in those populations. And those are the ideas. It's the experience I have. Yeah.
Comment on that, or do you want to ask another question? I know you've got a lot of questions.
Why don't we do another question? I'll address you. I'll address another question to you here. So the sort of idea of an impartial, objective journalism, I think, is fairly new. I think it didn't really take root until the past century or so. I think the newspapers were always fairly opinionated and non-objective. And so, do you think that as people bubble themselves in on social media and in rural and urban communities, do you think that advocacy journalism is a solution to this problem, or would it only make problems worse?
Well, I would say that we would first have to sort of unpack the notion of advocacy journalism, because I think when we hear that, you can think of anything from like fake news, just stuff that's made up, to advocate for a political cause, whether or not it's true. But advocacy journalism can also be things like, reporters reporting on the impact of climate change in local communities, and also including possible solutions in their reporting. So, I mean, I think to answer the first part of your question, I think that yes, the notion of objectivity is not inherent to journalism. It's something that's socially constructed, and it's also something that more recently, I think it's much more useful to think about things like truth or transparency or, a rigorous engagement with fact rather than objectivity, because objectivity is a very fraught term, and obviously we're all coming from different perspectives, and the most famous example of the flaws in objectivity is around climate change communication. So if you quote a climate denier and a climate scientist in every story, you give the impression as a journalist that 50% of climate scientists believe that it doesn't exist, which isn't the case. So I think journalists, especially around certain issues, like issues of the rise of white supremacy, issues of political speech from the highest office, issues of climate change, are actually seeing it as a moral imperative to call out what is true rather than seek two sides of the political spectrum of a story. So I do think that advocacy is a really important part of journalism, and it always has been. It's the idea that watchdogging the powers that be is not about advocacy for the public is, that's what it is. It's exactly what it is. So, yes.
Wow. All right. That is conclusive.
Yeah, and I would just echo everything that you said. I think people like myself, in a way, as sort of more opinion journalists and editorial pages, have messed things up for traditional journalism, in the sense that when you think of traditional media, you can have a really bad editorial page that's crazy right-wing or crazy left-wing, and you can have wonderful objective investigative reporting, which is advocacy of its own kind, but more kind of advocacy of, here's the issue that's going on in your local community, here's the abuse that's going on in the port. And so I agree with David Goldstein and others who've been saying this, and I did not subscribe to it when I was in a position when I could have done something, so hypocrite that I am. I would say that that if we continue with having editorial pages in traditional media and in papers such as everything from the Everett Herald to the Seattle Times, the LA Times, that people sign their editorials, so you know who on the editorial board said this, and that if it's supposed to be the I used to love writing those things. That it was like the voice on high, the God, like this is, and it's not only outdated, it's dangerous, or I think it shields any kind of accountability. That it should go back to the William Randolph Hearst days, even of having Hearst sign his own, and trying to get various opinions in a way, because I think I will say this, my understanding is that in journalism schools today, they're overflowing. They're getting great applicants. People want to continue to go to places like Columbia and Northwestern and the University of Oregon and other great programs. But and they are adapting to some of the new modes and recognizing the fact that technology, whether people like me are willing to accept this, we aren't oftentimes, is the fact that at least younger people are not going to want to wake up and get a newspaper to learn all the news that they've just learned online, either right the night before or first thing that morning. It's just not dynamic enough, and that's part of the problem, obviously, with keeping up with that.
So I'll be brief, and I want to actually build on echo what both Adrienne and Peter said. But I would love it. I would love it if an element of advocacy journalism became mainstream, and I could see many of the mainstream pundits on major news stations stop with the false equivocation, when it comes to white nationalism or when it comes to sexism, and particularly in terms of treating these perspectives as somewhat legitimate, because quite frankly they're not. And I say that, and I know for some might be controversial, but let's call it as it is. There are a number of times in major outlets where where you will have objectively racist positions being trot out as, oh, this is just another perspective. So what does the other side say? Or, oh, this is a perspective that exists, so therefore let's put it on at the same level as, say, an anti-racist perspective. No, I'm sorry, that's racism. That's belongs in a dustbin of history, but unfortunately, it's never left, right? And yeah.
That's actually something I wanted to talk about a little bit. KOW is recording this tonight. Hi, KOW. Of course, a couple of years ago, KOW ran an interview with somebody who was standing in downtown Seattle with a swastika armband, and they gave him anonymity. This was a very controversial moment in Seattle history because they did treat him as though his side, which was basically either the extermination or the outright forced removal of non-white races from America, they treated him as though that was a legitimate position, and that was a big moment. And of course, they did apologize after the fact, and they seem to have learned some lessons from that. But something that I learned from that is that the far right, the alt-right, is getting very good at working the refs and employing both sidesism to get some outrageous positions on the air. And we've touched on this a little bit. And we've also seen very wealthy people suing publications into oblivion, and that's something that I warn people who come to me and saying, I want to start a news site now. I'm like, well, you've got to be prepared for what happens when a very rich person who can hire a fleet of lawyers decides they don't like what you have to say about them, because that is a real problem now. So when we have this is a very uneven battlefield now, where one side is super good. It's kind of like watching the raptors in Jurassic Park figure out how to open the doors. It's like, oh my God, they've figured out the game. Like, we can't hide anymore. How can newsrooms sort of protect themselves from that sort of manipulation of the system? Can they? Adrienne, did you have something?
I think this is part of the reason why the conversation about objectivity and the changes in the news media environment need to be addressed both at the level of journalism training in journalism newsrooms, among journalism audiences, because if these conversations aren't had, then journalists don't actually know what the harm is going to be if they allow somebody from, with a swastika to go quoted anonymously. And I mean, that happened around the Charlottesville.
It was a little while after.
And there was, if you'll remember, there was like a really famous video, a Vice video, that was super successful, that actually deployed a similar tactic that sort of went up close and personal with these leaders of, these white supremacist leaders, but it was so clear that they were terrible that the video really worked. And I think that that's what they were trying to do in Seattle with that story. But it didn't work as well because they hadn't thought it through.
So on that, I think there are a couple of things. So, it happens. So, with that, I think one of the things that can be done to prevent such things from happening, and actually, Adrienne, I really liked what you said around having this conversation, because once we have the conversation, we have to start changing our practices. And for me, if I was a journalist and I'm at an anti-fascist rally, I'm sorry. I'm gonna focus on the anti-fascists. I'm going to focus on, I'm going to focus on the looking at the uh, looking at the people who are going to be most affected by the hate that is being spewed out there, because we know what it is. In fact, we have a long and tragic history that has taught us what it is. I say that we pelt these folks with tomatoes? Well, not quite. I don't know. Maybe if it's a Tuesday, maybe. But jokes aside, when it comes, that would be my first question. It's like, well, why interview that person instead of someone who, someone from the crowd who may have had an experience with, may have had an experience with police, or someone who is currently being demonized by this administration, and having their family stability threatened. And so taking that preventative measure and changing practices in that way, I think, is rather important, right? And this actually goes back to the previous question, right? And I want to, adopt a kind of long view of this, because historically speaking, when it comes to people of color in the media, that we have actually, for a very short amount of time, have had the mainstream mic. That representations of folks of color in the media still to this day have been beset upon by dog whistles, by stereotypes, things like that, and it was due to parallel sources, or parallel media sources that were developed in communities of color, that were developed in underrepresented communities, where we were able to get our message out there and be able to challenge those narratives, right? When the media is focusing there, and in fact, actually, it reminds now that I think about it, your question reminds me of a New York Times article where they, what was it? They so I'll say it was almost kind of sweet, down home, nonchalant, where they did this whole piece on a neo-Nazi, just following around this neo-Nazi in I want to say it was in yeah, I was in New York City, in or around New York City area, following around this neo-Nazi, his whole day-to-day, trying to show,
They're just like
look,
us.
yeah, exactly. It's like, look inside of his life, and I'm like, excuse me? No, what? No, like this. I'm sorry, I can't sympathize with a person that wants to see me and my family dead.
Yeah.
You
When
know,
you sympathize with a Nazi, you're a Nazi sympathizer.
yeah, yeah, exactly.
Uh,
Well, that's the thing, right?
Yeah.
Yet at the same time, the biggest question, one of the main questions that always comes up during a Black Lives Matter protest is, "Oh, is this going to remain peaceful?" I'm literally asking you not to shoot me. Yes, I think peace is the first thing on my mind, right? In fact, those kinds of stereotypes and the what was it, that really lack of critical questioning of that dynamic lends itself to many different things we see in real life, particularly the militarization, over policing of Black Lives Matter protesters and protests, and so on and so forth. Anyway, sorry, that was long.
That's okay. I'm going to ask one more question, but if you have questions, feel free to line up on either side of the stage, and we'll probably bounce back and forth. So if you have a question, line up now. But Peter, I wanted to ask you, as somebody who's been in the industry for a long time, what do you think people should know about being media consumers? Is there something people should know, or is it not anyone's? Is it not the audience's responsibility to be a smarter consumer?
It is the audience's responsibility to be a smarter consumer. There you go. There's the answer. I don't want to push back on this notion that there isn't objective journalism. I think we all come with our own biases, and my feeling is that for smart consumers, to recognize that quote unquote mainstream media is not as evil as it is portrayed in social media. I think you've had this intersection of a whole series of things, including the technological changes that we can't do anything about. But you also have, I mean, without mentioning the elephant in the room, but the elephant in the room being the President of the United States, who has harnessed social media in a way that has been more destructive, I'm sure, than anything that's happened at least in my lifetime. And that kind of hatred and demonization of enemies, repeated over and over and over again, has, I believe, made it difficult and required people to be more discriminating with media. I would hope that a smart consumer would do, sounds solipsistic or whatever, but do what I do, which is, and what my wife does, which is subscribe and read the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, at least we read it on the weekends, and then find those special niche places that are of interest to you. So I make it the Seattle Times, and Crosscut, and the Everett Herald, and permanent Kaiser Health News, with, again, the caveat with Kaiser Health News and this new model, what's their agenda? Technically there's no, but so it's going to be harder, and it breaks my heart. I mean, I think many of us in the room are old enough that in 3rd grade or 4th grade, 5th grade, we had to cut out those newspaper articles and report on the news story. President Nixon is doing blah blah blah, and give your compendium on. And I think that was not only an important writing exercise, but an important civic engagement exercise. My assumption is that doesn't happen anymore. I don't know, but yeah, no great insight there. I do think we're going through a really difficult time, and I think President Trump, who had a whole summit today where there was a fist fight in the Rose Garden between different factions of the crazies. I'm sure there's a more, I'm sure there's a better way of putting that, but the crazies, and it does enormous damage over time, and then compounded over time as well. I think.
Question?
Yeah, hi. I have a question. I'll direct it to Adrienne. Can a city function without a robust independent media?
This sounds like the tagline to this event here. Well, I would say it depends on what you think functioning is. I would say it functions much better if it has a robust media, and it's not just because of for the obvious reasons, like we need investigators to keep government officials and corporations in check, but also journalism traditionally ties communities together, and especially Seattle has so many people new to the city. There's so many different groups and different communities and different ethnicities that live in the city, and without a sort of common identity or a common, sort of meeting point in terms of information and stories about what's going on, it's very difficult to sort of call ourselves a community. So I would say, no, it cannot function without a robust media system.
Okay.
Hi. About Julian Assange. He, a lot of thoughts going on. I was shocked that these so-called journalists said that Julian Assange was not a journalist. He did not perform journalism. That showed me there was a void in the journalistic industry itself. They didn't come out of school understanding what journalism was, what free speech meant, and that was a shock to me. So what do you all think about what Julian Assange did, and related to now that habeas corpus is gone, Barack Obama got rid of that, and now if the government thinks that you're a terrorist, they can snatch you up off the street without due process, and that's going on today. People being arrested for their Facebook postings. And that only affects everything you write, that affects everything everyone in this room writes when they post something online. And I'm aware of it when I'm posting online. So that affects everything. And that is something you didn't touch on tonight.
So the question is, what do you think of Julian Assange, and what do you think of the
Yeah, and habeas corpus. Do you agree with
habeas corpus?
Yeah, it's funny. I was hoping one of you guys would get this. No, I'm just joking with you. I thought it was important, and in fact, I remember when the war logs came out. I remember when WikiLeaks leaked those, and the media storm. In fact, it was a big watershed moment. But one thing I'll say is this, and actually, I do want to touch on a couple of things that the importance in actually. I don't want to speak to Assange itself, but the importance of investigative journalism is especially especially pressing now because of media consolidation, and you don't have that much space for investigative journalism by media outlets. Actually, going to your question before, Paul, without you don't have that much space for investigative journalism from independent media outlets because of the possibility of retribution from from uh, very wealthy people, And one thing I do want to say though about Assange, and this kind of comes from my own biases. Honestly, I feel like the logs itself and the leak of the logs these days are conflated. Are The importance of that is conflated with whether or not to believe the victims of alleged sexual assaults by him. Because I personally believe in believing victims. So that's one thing I want to put out there too. I know it kind of comes from left field, but it's something that in conversations with friends that I think definitely should not be overshadowed when talking about that particular individual and the importance of investigative journalism as a whole.
I can make a quick comment on that. I mean, I think Julian Assange is a tricky case, as Cliff pointed out, but I do think that the leaks were important, and I think that they gave people a lot of information that we would have otherwise not had, obviously. And I think, more importantly, leak culture today is a really important part of information and journalism that we get. Almost everything we know that goes on in the White House comes from leaks. The press corps is not getting information at press briefings. If you take Edward Snowden, for example, it's easier to see the contribution to civic discourse and informing the public that he made, because that case isn't shrouded in questions of his personal ethics or morality. But also, he benefited from the leakers that came before him. Julian Assange's mistakes were, what drove Edward Snowden to leave before he made before he leaked the documents, to make the videos, to come out and say who he was, all these things. And the Panama Papers are another, even more sophisticated example of all this information that was delivered to, and sorted through by news organizations without any person becoming associated with them or being blamed for them. So I don't know if it is an important part of journalism. I don't know that I would call Julian Assange a journalist, but he certainly contributed to journalism, as have all the leakers that we've seen in the past years.
You just kind of echoed everything in a very articulate way that I would not have been able to do. And it's a reminder to someone like me, who I need to separate my personal feelings against Assange and the sort of the creepiness factor that I personally that he evokes, and recognize that there are principles of press freedom that transcend the creepiness factor.
I'm a local photographer, and I pay Google about $1,000 a month to run advertising for me. And I think before the internet, that money would have gone to print media. Is there a plan, or are there ideas for recouping some of that advertising revenue that has been lost?
I don't have a good answer for that, but I see that we may have the former editor-in-chief of the Everett Herald, Neil Pattison, who might have a good response, because I do think, and who loves photography, by the way, because you're right. I think and how can you be a full-time photographer anymore? I mean, that's the other thing that's so infuriating. Not only with how can you afford to pay a mortgage and raise children as a journalist, how can you be a news photographer? And photojournalism is so critical. So I wish I had an answer.
Really quick. My fiance, who is very talented and wonderful, and by the way, if you're watching, love you. She is an artist, and really she has to adopt a very multifaceted social media strategy to get herself out there. So it's difficult, and it's actually, just to echo what you were saying, Peter, for a lot of people who are photographers, who are freelancers, who are artists, it is prohibitively costly to get into that field if you are not in a major media institution. That being said, there's not a easy answer, but adopting a larger social media strategy, and I know this might sound a bit silly, but a way to build on your relationships, and a way to find, essentially to find what the different platforms where there isn't a, if you will, we're on tip of my tongue, where there isn't a major concentration of photographers, or in your case, or artists, things like that. That's a really good strategy as well.
So do you have anything to say about advertising before you ask your question? Or
Yeah, I was going to ask in that comment, but I'd start by saying that the best paid and some of the most talented photographers and videographers in the Seattle area now work for the newsroom at Starbucks. Starbucks has a newsroom, and they go around the world documenting how great coffee culture is, how great Italy is, how great Kenya is, how great the farmers are, how great the processing is. That's where the money's going for talented graphic journalism these days. Lots of people want their story out there. They just don't want it told by independent journalists. They want it told by bought and paid for journalists. But that's not what I was here to talk about. But, and they're great photographers. I've worked with them. They were pro photojournalists before they went to Starbucks, but that's where they're working now, and I'm sure Starbucks is not the only one. Maybe Kaiser Health has a photographer. I don't know, Peter. The reason I came tonight, well, one, the copy desk called and wanted me to tell you that the media isn't dying, the media are dying, just right. For the copy. But
is Seattle is dying or Seattle are dying? Are we yeah.
Okay. If you run a newspaper, and that's my background, I've managed 3, you pay people to drive trucks, to run presses, to clean the desks at night, and also some people to sell ads, and then a few people left over who actually report the news. If you go into most newspaper models, and this is pretty universal in North America, it's a little different in Europe, 15% of the revenue that comes in goes to reporting. 15%. 65% of the revenue comes in from advertising. So here we are laughing at Starbucks, but 65% of the money that has traditionally supported news came from advertisers. And that's what this disruption is all about. It's not about readers fleeing news, it's about advertisers fleeing the platform. And so I know you didn't have exact numbers, but I think we're down about 40% in the state of Washington for working journalists over the last decade, about 40%. And Pew just put out a report that showed cities without robust newspapers or without any newspapers pay higher bond ratings because their government's not as responsible. They have more cases of corruption. all the way down the line, it costs more. Your taxes will be higher if you live in a city without a newspaper. And I wish I could quote the source on that, but I don't have it with me.
There's also more corporate pollution too,
Yeah.
without a local newspaper, not just sources of news, but newspapers.
Yeah. So my question is, we talked about having millionaires to write check for Crosscut. We've talked about advocacy. We've talked about startups. We've talked about the membership model. It seems to me if we're not going to have 65% of our money coming from advertisers, and we don't need it because we're not going to have presses and trucks in the future. All we're going to have is journalists, right, and keyboards. We need the readers to be the ones who pay the bill, because that's who we're supposed to be responsible to, right, the readers? So where's that going to go? Can we motivate the public to pay $10 to $20 a month for a source of news? They go, I can get it online. I mean, I can't tell you the number of times that people tell me I don't need to pay for news. It's everywhere. I can get it anytime I want it for free. What's going to push people over the edge to the point where they say, we've got to pay for news? And I don't think it ought to be out of some righteous or sanctimonious, because it's the right thing. They should be paying for news because they like the news, they want the news, they need the news, they appreciate the news. Not just because it's spinach and they told you to eat your spinach. So I really, when I came here, I was hoping we're going to hear about what is the financial model for newspapers, not newspapers, that's my old talk, news organizations going forward. Are they going to be massive? Are they going to be a whole lot of small ones? Can they join together? I really would like to know what the latest thinking is on how we pay for news. Because the one thing I've learned, and I'm happy to say I retired 3 months ago, here's what I learned. Peter, I have some disappointing news for you today. Our company is reducing positions, and yours is one of them. The person from HR is here to give you a packet. I've done that more times than I care to remember. And that's what's going to keep happening if we don't find a way to pay reporters. We lay them off.
Adrienne? You've been so good with the curt responses, I thought maybe you could come up with something.
Well, okay, here's a quick one. Why are we asking readers to pay? Why aren't we asking for taxes or some kind of government funds for news, which is essential to the functioning of democracy? I mean, I don't know the answer to this, and I don't know how we could ever possibly swing this, but it is interesting to me that in the US model, it's just never considered, it's so rarely considered, it's just always supposed to be on the shoulders of readers, but actually we've seen that democracy isn't really going to function much longer unless we strengthen news organizations of some sort. So that's my succinct not answer question.
I mean, to me, part of the problem is that newspapers sometimes have to tell stories that readers don't want to hear, right? Or you know, one of the big changes at The Stranger when a lot of the staff left was when they got Chartbeat, which is an analytics software that shows exactly where readers' eyes are on the story, and you find out how many readers don't finish the story and how many readers, how many readers are on it at any given time, and you can actually like track their eyeballs down the page. And it changed the course of coverage, and it changed the direction, and so it was giving people what they want based on what they were reading, but that doesn't seem like exactly like a newspaper's job, right? So yeah, I mean the question has to do with, I've heard of tax models. Are there places that do it very well? I mean, aside from, I guess, BBC and...
Yeah, I mean, like all of the Nordic countries, a lot of European countries, I mean, it's seen as a public utility or public good, and it's funded. I mean, I think it's sort of written into the culture of the US that there's just some kind of hideousness to the notion that the government would fund information, but at the same time, corporations have so distorted and shaped and influenced our information landscape that I think that's becoming more and more apparent that maybe it's time to consider this other possibility.
And I assume NPR is probably the closest analog that we have because of the Corporation for public broadcasting, but it's still not adequate. And I wish. I mean, it seems to me, because people have been brainstorming this for so long and still haven't come up with a sustainable.
It's always been around the corner.
Yeah, a sustainable financial model. The only thing I can think of is if there was an agreement sector-wide of we charge, unless you're a subscriber, you cannot even have one free visit. I mean, we all do the free visits to different, but it's such a it's just a competitive. It's just such a competitive market, and yeah, I mean, the nonprofit model. I don't have an answer. Yeah.
So, one thing I want to bring up is because I've actually thought about this quite a bit, especially when I remember very early on, when I was just running Buffalo Indie Media, I was talking with some of the other activists, and I said, okay, well, should we start charging people? And one of the things that occurred to me very early on is people would really like to support something that speaks to something that needs to be said. In fact, if you look online these days to a number of the YouTubers, number of the blogs, and different online outlets, that those outlets that are more adversarial, that have an advocacy streak to them, that they are able to build up a membership. And mind you, this of course is not going to be a surefire solution, because I actually absolutely support the idea of having some public funding. I mean, hell, if we're going to, subsidize petrol and, give subsidies to oil companies, I think that giving subsidies, creating a fund in order to support very broadly a free press, a press that doesn't have to just supplicate to advertisers, is a good idea. But also building that firm advocacy component into it is a way to start bringing people back, right? And it doesn't have to necessarily go one way or the other, but again, something where we are speaking truth to power.
Okay. We've got 2 more people up, and that will be it for the evening. You want to go?
Yeah, in larger markets, in larger media, is the problem of profitability, or is the problem not that they can't produce hedge fund profitability? And related to that, given the danger to democracy, why do left-leaning billionaires not fund media the way that right-wing billionaires do? Particularly in a place like Seattle, which has 4, 5, 10 rather rich people, including your boss.
My boss, Nick Hanauer, yeah. Well, since you're putting me on the spot, I can say that Nick doesn't want to run a media empire, and that's never been one of his goals. And honestly, I'm not a big fan of.
He has a podcast.
Well, he does have a podcast, yes, but that's not a media empire. A podcast is different. It's called Pitchfork Economics, and it's available anywhere you get your podcasts, and I'm on it sometimes. But yeah, I'm not sure I want a bunch of billionaires to run the news. I read the Washington Post and I love it, but I get a little itchy, and it's like I don't think that it's necessarily. I don't mean to hoard the conversation here. I'm sorry, but it's not. It's what I'm worried about is not something as direct as Jeff Bezos walking down to somebody's desk and saying, "You're killing that story." It's, when you work somewhere, you are aware of who's writing the checks, That was one of the big responses when Como put out Seattle is Dying. They said, well, we weren't told to do this. And it's like, well, you weren't told to do this, but you understand that you're owned by Sinclair, and Sinclair has a conservative lean to it. So it always influences you. The person writing the checks always influences you. And you're maybe not going to pursue a story quite as hard if you know that it's going to cost your boss $100 million. So it just, the angel investors seem to be a difficult and not really satisfying answer. And I'm sorry I hoarded the time. Does anybody have anything to say to his response?
Yes. Cool. Awesome. So I want to push back just a little bit, Paul, because with the ethos, what you're saying, the values and what you're saying, I absolutely agree with. Because, and this actually speaks to something I said earlier, that the people behind the people, on the typewriter and so forth, the people writing the checks, definitely influence coverage. On the other hand, we do see a hack gap when it comes to, when it comes to the media. I mean, Roger Ailes helped found Fox News. That we have conservatives. We have conservatives increasingly investing in gobbling up media sources. So yeah, and I don't want to necessarily say we have. Well, I am gonna kind of say it, but we do need some support. We do need some support from whether it's left-wing billionaires or different. Hell, if a community foundation wants to found a left-wing or left-leaning grassroots blog or media site or media center, yes, we absolutely need that, because right now because it's not even a slightly asymmetrical playing field. That for the left side of the media and even the center, that they are in a valley, while on the right side, that they, or a better way to put this, on the right, it's basically tipped the scales in their favor, absolutely and completely. Whereas with the center and the left, we're essentially trying to articulate different perspectives within a terrain that is thoroughly dominated by right-leaning rhetoric and propaganda, et cetera, et cetera. So, we do need wealthy left-leaning people to step up and help to fund progressive media. Real talk.
Why won't you guys whine more about money? And I'm serious about this. I love journalism, but not like it's not my favorite thing in the world. I appreciate it. I'm willing to pay a little bit for it. It's not my life, but it's reporters' lives, and it's important stuff. 25 years ago, we'd spend $170 on a little classified ad in the Times, Seattle Times, to sell a house. I'm not sure I'd pay $170, a week to buy the Seattle Times to keep journalists afloat. But part of it is because you guys, not you four, don't whine enough about the evisceration of the advertising dollar, Craigslist, Google, what it's done to the financing model. You kind of are like, support us because we need support, which is absolutely valid and true, but it's kind of like a 60s non-feminist saying, I don't need feminism. It seems like the journalistic community completely ignores the fact that the funding has gone away and won't identify what the funding was and won't ask for ways to replace that. Because I agree, we don't need angel billionaires, because then you just work for them. It's like working for Hearst, right? What's the difference? You want to be independent journalists, you want the public to fund it. We need an intermediate financing source. We need to remember where the financing came from, and we need to figure out how to replace that financing, because I don't think it's going to work with us just doing $65 for internet a month, $15 for HBO, $15 for Netflix, $15 for the New York or Seattle Times or whatever. At some point, we're going to stop paying $15 a month, and we still need to fund journalists. And I think that journalists need to whine a lot more about where the funding used to be, how it's disappeared, and how it's going to be replaced.
Excellent question. Peter, why don't you whine more?
I do whine, but I whine privately and in a Nordic kind of reticent way. I think that's right on. I think that the problem is, from a message standpoint, it's kind of like when a business is beginning to kind of circle the drain, so to speak. People do not want to invest in something that they feel is failing, and I think journalists are cognizant of not wanting to say, "Oh, we're not being able to, we're not paying our people well enough. This is a civic imperative. Please show us your money, because I worry about kind of the begging model, but begging model might be kind of a corollary of the whining model. But what do any of us do if like your niece or nephew or child or grandchild says, I want to be a journalist, and you do like this? I mean, there's still, and Neil knows this better than anyone, there are still these young people who were editors of their paper in college who are so bright and so capable and do understand the when, what, where, why. I mean, it's that next generation that I fear and worry about. So I don't have a good answer to any of that, do I? Anyway.
Adrienne, do you have an answer?
Yeah, I mean, I would just add, maybe whining isn't the answer, but maybe covering the story and all of its nuances, like the huge business and political and community story that it is, would help as well. So, you know, most journalism outlets have done a pretty weak job of covering issues related to Facebook and election fraud and tampering, and issues of venture capitalist companies owning newspapers and then laying off half the staff. All of these things should be a central beat of media that's concerned with public life, but it's journalists tend to be timid for obvious reasons about covering, you know, the business practices behind their owners until it's too late. So maybe a little bit more hard-hitting investigative journalism around the media landscape might help a little bit.
Okay. All right, we are running right up against our hard stop time, so I hope you will come up and talk afterwards. We will be having another one of these panels, I believe, in September to talk more about the media, because there were any number of things that I could have directed the conversation towards and just spent the whole night on one issue. So I want to thank the panel. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Cliff. Thank you, Adrienne. Thank you all so much for coming out, and thank you for Town Hall, and have a great night. Thank you.